Zixtal pressed his 4 hands against the viewing port of the Coalition ship, Starward Harmony, and watched the human vessel Iron Phoenix drift alongside them in the darkness of space. The human ship looked different from all the other Coalition vessels in their fleet. Where most ships curved and flowed like living things, the human ship had sharp angles and brutal lines. It looked like it was built for one purpose only: war god. This was Zixtal's first mission working with humans, and he was not sure what to expect. His people had joined the Galactic Coalition 300 years ago. In all that time, they had worked with many species. The tall and graceful Velinari with their crystal weapons, the strong Korgan warriors with their thick armor-like skin, the wise Etherians who could see the future in brief glimpses. All of these species made sense to Zixtal, but humans were new to the galaxy. They had only joined the Coalition 5 years ago, and already they had a reputation. Some said humans were reckless. Others said they were dangerous. A few claimed they were completely insane. Zixtal had read the reports. Humans had no natural armor. They could not breathe in space without machines. They had no telepathic abilities. They could not manipulate energy with their minds. By all measures, they should have been one of the weakest species in the galaxy. Yet somehow, in every battle they fought, something unexpected happened. Admiral Vexmore's voice echoed through the ship's communication system. His deep, rumbling words carried the weight of centuries of military experience. All ships, prepare for briefing. We have received new intelligence about our target. Zixtal made his way to the main briefing room, where officers from different Coalition ships had gathered through holographic projection. The room filled with representatives from dozens of species, but his attention was drawn to the humans. There were 3 of them. A man with gray hair and scars across his left temple stood at attention. This had to be Captain Jake Murphy, commander of the Iron Phoenix. Next to him stood a woman with dark hair pulled back severely. Her eyes moved, constantly studying everything around her. The third human was a large man with massive shoulders who looked like he could break most beings in half with his bare hands. Admiral Vexmore activated the central display, and a 3-dimensional image of a green and blue planet appeared. This, Ice Kepler 442b, he said, home to 2.3 million civilians of various Coalition species. 12 hours ago, we detected a massive void swarm fleet approaching the system. Zixtal felt his skin turn cold. The void swarm was every living being's nightmare. They were a hive mind that consumed entire worlds. They turned planets into dead rocks and used the life force they absorbed to grow stronger. No one knew where they came from. No one knew how to negotiate with them. The only thing anyone knew was that when the swarm arrived, everything died. Intelligence estimates over 10,000 bioships in the enemy fleet. Admiral Vexmore continued. We have 200 Coalition vessels. The odds are not in our favor. One of the Korgan officers spoke up. Admiral, perhaps we should consider evacuation procedures. If we cannot win this battle, evacuation will take too long, Captain Murphy interrupted. The human's voice was calm and steady. The swarm moves fast. By the time we get the civilian transports loaded and away from the gravity well, they'll be on top of us. We need to buy time. Admiral Vexmore nodded. Captain Murphy is correct. Our only option is to engage the enemy fleet in space and hold them as long as possible while civilian evacuation proceeds. Zixtal studied the human captain. Murphy looked at the tactical display with the same expression Zixtal's people used when examining a particularly interesting scientific problem. There was no fear in his eyes, no concern about the impossible odds. He simply looked at the situation and began calculating solutions. The woman next to Murphy spoke for the first time. Admiral, if I may suggest something. The swarm bioships. adapt to energy weapons quickly, but they have trouble with kinetic strikes. If we coordinate our attacks, Lieutenant Rodriguez, Admiral Vexmore said, please continue. Rodriguez stepped forward and pointed at the display. The bioships communicate through organic neural networks. If we can disrupt those networks with targeted electromagnetic pulses while hitting them with physical projectiles, we might be able to slow their adaptation rate. Zixtal was impressed, despite himself. The human woman had identified a weakness in swarm tactics that coalition scientists had missed for decades. But what impressed him more was how she presented the information. No hesitation, no doubt. Just cold, hard tactical analysis. The large human spoke next. My Marines can handle boarding actions if needed, Admiral. We've got experience fighting in close quarters. Admiral Vexmore looked surprised. Sergeant Walsh, boarding a swarm bioship is essentially suicide. Their internal defenses are designed to stop most coalition species, Walsh replied with a slight smile. But humans are good at being underestimated. After the briefing ended, Zixtal found himself walking alongside the humans as they returned to their shuttle. He had to ask, Captain Murphy, do you really believe you can win this battle? Murphy stopped and looked at Zixtal with those steady eyes. Win? Probably not. But winning isn't always the point, is it? Sometimes you fight because someone has to. Sometimes you fight because if you don't, the people you're supposed to protect die. But the odds are what they are, Rodriguez said. We can't change them. We can only change what we do about them. Walsh laughed, a deep sound that echoed off the shuttle bay walls. Besides, odds are for people who have something to lose. We're already committed. Zixtal watched the humans board their shuttle and return to the Iron Phoenix. He had served in the coalition military for 40 years. He had seen brave soldiers from many species. He had watched warriors face impossible odds with courage and dignity. But there was something different about these humans. They didn't seem brave. They seemed inevitable, like forces of nature that had decided to move in a particular direction and would continue moving until something stopped them as the fleet prepared to enter hyperspace for the journey to Kepler 442b. Zixtal found himself thinking about what he had observed. The humans were smaller than most coalition species. They were physically weaker. They had no special abilities. But they had something else. Something that made them dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with size or strength. They had already decided they were going to fight. Not because they thought they could win. Not because they were fearless. But because they had decided that some things were more important than their own survival. Zixtal had never encountered beings who approached warfare with such calm certainty about their own willingness to die. The hyperspace jump began, and stars stretched into lines outside the viewing ports. In 6 hours, they would reach Kepler 442b. In 6 hours, Zixtal would see what happened when humans faced the most terrifying enemy in the galaxy. He found himself both curious and afraid to learn what that would look like. The Void Swarm fleet hung in space above Kepler 442b like a disease. Zixtal stared at the tactical display and tried to count the enemy bioships, but they moved and shifted like living creatures. Some were the size of coalition destroyers. Others stretched for kilometers, their organic hulls pulsing with unnatural light. The largest ones looked like floating cities made of bone and flesh. Contact in 30 minutes, reported the Starward Harmony's tactical officer. Enemy formation is spreading to surround the planet. Admiral Vexmore's voice crackled across the Coalition fleet communication channel. All ships engage at maximum range. Do not allow them to establish orbital positions. Zixtal watched as the Coalition fleet accelerated toward the enemy. Energy weapons began firing from both sides, creating brilliant flashes of light in the darkness. The first exchange went well for the coalition forces. Several smaller bioships dissolved under concentrated fire from the fleet's heavy weapons. But then something changed. The swarm bioships began to shift and adapt. Their organic hulls grew thicker in the spots where energy weapons struck them. New growths appeared on their surfaces, deflecting laser fire back toward the coalition ships. Within minutes, weapons that had been effective became useless. "They're adapting faster than expected," reported Lieutenant Rodriguez from the Iron. "Phoenix recommends switching to kinetic weapons." Admiral Vexmore gave the order, and the coalition ships began firing physical projectiles instead of energy beams. This worked better, but not well enough. For each bioship they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The swarm fleet was simply too large. Zixtal felt the starward harmony shake as enemy bioweapons struck the hull. These were not the clean energy weapons used by most civilized species. Swarm weapons fired living projectiles that burrowed into ship hulls and began consuming them from the inside. He watched his fellow crew members work frantically to cut away infected sections of the ship before the bioweapons could spread. "Starward harmony, this is Iron Phoenix." Captain Murphy's voice came over the communication system. "We're seeing heavy damage to your port side. Do you need assistance?" "Negative, Iron Phoenix," Admiral Vexmore replied. "Maintain your position in the battle line." But Murphy was already moving his ship toward them. Zixtal could see the Iron Phoenix on the tactical display, breaking formation to provide cover for the damaged coalition vessel. Energy fire that had been targeting the Starward Harmony suddenly shifted to the human ship instead. "Murphy, what are you doing?" Admiral Vexmore demanded. "Buying you time to make repairs," Murphy replied calmly, as his ship took hit after hit from swarm weapons. "Rodriguez, target that big one on our starboard side. Walsh, get your Marines ready for boarding." Action. Zixtal couldn't believe what he was hearing. The humans were preparing to board a swarm bioship. Every military manual in the coalition clearly stated that boarding actions against the swarm were impossible. The bioships were filled with defensive organisms that would kill any boarding party within minutes. "Captain Murphy," Admiral Vexmore sighed, "boarding a swarm vessel is suicide." "I cannot authorize—" "You're not authorizing it, Admiral," Murphy interrupted. "I am." The Iron Phoenix moved closer to one of the larger bioships, taking massive damage as it approached. Zixtal could see sections of the human vessel's hull glowing red from enemy fire. Atmosphere vented from dozens of breaches. Any reasonable commander would have pulled back to a safe distance. Instead, Murphy accelerated. "Boarding pods away," Sergeant Walsh reported. His voice was calm, as if he were reporting the weather instead of leading his Marines into certain death. Zixtal switched his display to show the boarding action. He watched 12 small pods launch from the Iron Phoenix and impact against the bioship's hull. Immediately, the organic surface began trying to digest the pods, but the Marines inside were cutting their way through faster than the bioship could adapt. The camera feed from Sergeant Walsh's helmet showed the interior of the bioship. It was a nightmare of living walls and breathing corridors. Defensive organisms that looked like a cross between spiders and snakes dropped from the ceiling. The bioturrets grew from the walls and began firing acid at the Marines, but the humans kept moving forward. They used weapons Zixtal had never seen before. Instead of clean energy beams, they fired explosive projectiles that tore through organic material. When defensive organisms attacked them, they fought with knives and bare hands. One Marine, Private Lisa Stone, was caught by biotendrils that wrapped around her legs and began dragging her toward what looked like a feeding mouth in the wall. Zixtal expected her squad mates to follow military protocol and abandon her. No soldier's life was worth risking the entire mission. But the humans did something that made no tactical sense. They turned around and fought to save Forgot Private Rick Carter threw himself at the biotendrils, hacking at them with a combat knife, while screaming words that Zixtal's translator couldn't process. Marine Nina Brooks fired her weapon point-blank into the feeding mouth until it released stone and retreated into the wall. They saved her, but Carter and Brooks were overwhelmed by defensive organisms in the process. 2 down, Walsh reported, without emotion, continuing to primary target. Zixtal couldn't understand it. The humans had just sacrificed 2 soldiers to save one. From a purely tactical standpoint, it was inefficient. From a mathematical standpoint, it was wasteful. But they had done it anyway, and now they were continuing their mission as if nothing had happened. The boarding party reached their target, a massive organic structure that pulsed with bioelectric energy. This was the bioship's coordination center, the organ that allowed it to communicate with the rest of the swarm fleet. Charges set, Walsh reported. Extraction in 30 seconds. But the extraction never came. The bioship had sealed off the yaw. Corridors behind them. The Marines were trapped inside a living vessel that was actively trying to digest them. They should have panicked. They should have begged for rescue. Instead, they prepared to die completing their mission. Detonation. In 10 seconds, Walsh announced. It's been an honor serving with you all. The explosion lit up space as the bioship's coordination center was destroyed. The massive vessel began to drift, no longer able to coordinate with the rest of the swarm fleet. Several nearby bioships also became confused and began firing on each other instead of the coalition forces. But the victory came at a terrible cost. 12 Marines had died to disable one enemy ship. The coalition was still outnumbered more than 50 to 1. Those ships continued to pour weapons fire into the fleet. Ships were dying faster than they could be replaced. All ships begin withdrawal. To planetary defense positions, Admiral Vexmore ordered. We cannot hold them in space. As the coalition fleet retreated toward Kepler 442b, Zixtal found himself thinking about what he had witnessed. The humans had not fought like any species. He knew. They had not calculated odds or minimized losses. They had simply decided that some things were worth dying for, and then acted on that decision without hesitation. The space battle was lost, but something had changed in the way Zixtal looked at his human allies. They were not just another species, fighting alongside the coalition. They were something else entirely, something that turned the mathematics of warfare into something personal and immediate and terrifying. The surface of Kepler 442b was chaos. Refugee camps stretched across the planetary defense zone like a scattered maze of temporary shelters and medical stations. Families from dozens of different species huddled together while coalition forces worked frantically to load civilian transports. The air was filled with the sound of crying children, worried parents calling for lost family members, and the constant roar of ships taking off for the safety of deep space. Zixtal helped carry wounded coalition soldiers from the landing shuttles to the medical tents. The space battle had cost them nearly half their fleet. The Iron Phoenix had made it to the surface, but barely. Captain Murphy walked with a limp now, his left arm in a medical support sleeve. Lieutenant Rodriguez had a bandage wrapped around her head, covering a gash from where a piece of her bridge console had exploded. Of the human Marines, only 8 had survived the retreat from orbit. How long until the next wave of transports? Murphy asked the evacuation coordinator, a tall Velinari female with crystal blue skin. 6 hours for the next group, she replied without looking up from her data pad. But we can only take 12,000 civilians per wave. At this rate, it will take 4 days to evacuate everyone. Murphy's jaw tightened. We don't have 4 days. The swarm will start ground operations within hours. As if summoned by his words, The first biopods began falling from the sky. They looked like massive eggs wrapped in organic armor, each one the size of a small building. When they hit the ground, they cracked open and released creatures that had been designed for one purpose: killing everything they encountered. Zixtel had seen swarm ground forces in training videos, but facing them in reality was completely different. The bioconstructs stood 3 meters tall on 6 legs that ended in razor-sharp claws. Their heads were mostly mouth, filled with rows of teeth that could bite through Coalition body armor. Worse, they moved in coordination, as if controlled by a single mind. The Coalition defensive line opened fire as soon as the first bioconstructs appeared. Energy weapons lit up the twilight sky as soldiers tried to stop the advancing creatures. But just like in space, the bioconstructs began adapting to the weapons being used against them. Their skin grew thicker. Their movements became faster. Within minutes, they were charging through defensive positions that should have stopped them cold. Fall back to secondary positions. Admiral Vexmore ordered over the communication system. All non-essential personnel begin immediate evacuation. But the humans didn't fall back. Zixtel watched as Sergeant Walsh gathered his remaining Marines and began moving toward the refugee camps instead of away from them. Private Lisa Stone, still bandaged from her injuries in the space battle, picked up a heavy weapon system and began setting it up between the bioconstructs and a camp filled with young families. "Stone, what are you doing?" Zixtel called out as he ran toward her position. "My job," she replied, without taking her eyes off the approaching enemies. "These people can't defend themselves." 3 bioconstructs broke through the main defensive line and charged toward the refugee camp. Stone opened fire with her heavy weapon, cutting down 2 of them before the third one reached her position. Zixtel expected her to retreat or call for backup. Instead, she dropped her empty weapon and pulled out a combat knife. The bioconstruct was 3 times her size and covered in natural armor that had already adapted to resist Coalition weapons. Any reasonable person would have run. Stone charged it head-on, screaming something that Zixtel's translator rendered as a string of creative profanity. She couldn't win. The bioconstruct was faster and stronger. Its claws raked across her body armor, leaving deep gouges. Its teeth snapped at her head as she rolled between its legs. But she kept fighting, kept stabbing at joints and soft spots, kept making it. Focus on her instead of the families hiding in the camp. Behind her dot, other Marines arrived and killed the bioconstruct, but not before it had nearly killed Stone. As medical personnel worked to stop her bleeding, she grabbed Zixtel's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone who had lost so much blood. "The families," she whispered. "Are they safe?" Zixtel looked toward the refugee camp where parents were holding their children close, all of them alive because one human soldier had decided their lives were worth more than her own safety. "They're safe," he told her. Stone smiled and let the medics take her away. That night, during a brief lull in the fighting, Zixtel found Captain Murphy sitting alone outside the command tent. The human was staring at a small photograph in his hands. Even in the dim light, Zixtel could see it showed a young girl with Murphy's eyes and a bright smile. "Your offspring?" Zixtel asked. Murphy nodded. "Katie. She's 8 years old. Lives. With her mother back on Earth." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I haven't seen her in 6 months." "Why do you carry her image?" "To remember what I'm fighting for," Murphy replied. "It's easy to forget sometimes when you're in the middle of all this death and chaos. But then I look at this picture, and I remember that somewhere in the galaxy, there's a little girl who believes her daddy is going to come home. There are millions of little girls and boys just like her, from dozens of different species, who are counting on us to keep them safe." Zixtel studied the human's face in the dim light. For the first time since meeting him, Murphy looked tired. Not just physically tired, but emotionally exhausted. The calm confidence he had shown during the space battle was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Captain," Zixtal said carefully, "are you afraid?" Murphy was quiet for so long that Zixtal thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Terrified. Every minute of every day. Afraid I'm going to make the wrong decision and get good people killed. Afraid I'm going to fail the families depending on us. Afraid I'm never going to see Katie again. But you continue to fight. Because being afraid doesn't change what needs to be done," Murphy said. "My daughter is going to grow up in a galaxy where the swarm exists. The children in those refugee camps are going to face dangers I can't even imagine. The only thing I can do is try to make sure they have a chance to grow up at all." He put the photograph away and stood up. The tired, frightened father disappeared, replaced once again by the calm military commander. But Zixtal had seen behind the mask now. He understood something about humans that no coalition manual had ever explained. They weren't fearless warriors. They weren't naturally brave. They were ordinary beings who felt fear just like everyone else. The difference was that they had learned to use their fear as fuel instead of letting it paralyze them. They fought not because they weren't afraid, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they stopped fighting Dot as biopods continued to fall from the sky and the sounds of battle grew closer to the refugee camps. Zixtal realized that he was about to see what happened when frightened humans decided that fear was less important than duty. The thought both inspired and terrified him. Dawn brought no relief. The eastern horizon glowed red, not from the rising sun, but from the fires of burning coalition positions. Throughout the night, more biopods had fallen from orbit. Now the ground swarmed with thousands of bioconstructs, all moving with single-minded purpose toward the refugee camps and evacuation sites. Zixtal stood in the command center and watched the tactical display with growing horror. Red symbols representing enemy forces covered nearly half the map. Blue symbols showing coalition positions flickered and disappeared one by one as defensive lines collapsed. In the center of it all, a small cluster of green symbols marked the location of the main refugee camp, where nearly 500,000 civilians waited for transport ships that might never come. "Final evacuation wave departs in 4 hours," reported the Velinari coordinator. "But the enemy will reach the camps in 2 hours at current advance rate." Admiral Vexmore studied the display with grim concentration. "Can we hold them for 2 hours?" "Not with conventional tactics," Lieutenant Rodriguez said. She had been working at a tactical station for 3 hours straight, her bandaged head bent over probability calculations and defensive scenarios. "We don't have enough soldiers left, and the bioconstructs are adapting to our weapons faster than we can modify them. Then we evacuate what we can and abandon the rest," Admiral Vexmore said quietly. "No," Captain Murphy's voice cut through the command center like a knife. "We don't abandon civilians. Captain, be realistic. We cannot hold. We can hold." Murphy interrupted, "But not from static defensive positions. Not with conventional tactics." He looked around the command center at the assembled officers from different coalition species. "Request permission to take all human forces and establish a forward defensive line at grid reference 77 Alpha." Zixtal checked his tactical display. Grid reference 77 Alpha was a narrow valley between 2 hills, directly in the path of the main swarm advance. It was also less than a kilometer from the refugee camps. Any force that tried to hold that position would be completely surrounded within minutes. "Captain Murphy," Admiral Vexmore said slowly, "that position is indefensible. Any unit stationed there would be cut off and destroyed," Murphy finished. "Yes, I know. But it's also the perfect place to make the enemy pay for every meter of ground. If we can hold them there for 2 hours, the civilians get out safely. The command center fell silent. Everyone understood what Murphy was proposing. He wanted to take his remaining humans and make a suicide stand to buy time for the evacuation. It was tactically sound, but it meant certain death for everyone involved. "How many soldiers are you talking about?" Admiral Dexmore asked. 47. "Humans still combat effective," Sergeant Walsh reported. "Plus whatever volunteers want to join us." "I volunteer," Zixtal heard himself say. The words came out before he could think about them. Every logical part of his mind told him this was insane, but he couldn't stop himself from stepping forward. Murphy looked at him with those steady eyes. "You don't have to do this, Zixtal. This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," Zixtal replied. "Those civilians down there include families from my species. Children who should grow up to see the stars. This became my fight the moment I put on this uniform." A few other coalition officers volunteered as well, but most remained silent. Zixtal couldn't blame them. What Murphy was planning wasn't military strategy. It was martyrdom. "All human forces, prepare for immediate deployment to forward positions," Murphy ordered. "Coalition volunteers, you're welcome to join us, but understand what you're signing up for. We're not planning to retreat from this position. We're not planning to be rescued. We're planning to hold the line until the last civilian transport clears the atmosphere, no matter what it costs." As the mixed force of humans and coalition volunteers prepared to move out, Zixtal noticed something strange about the human soldiers. They weren't making speeches about glory or honor. They weren't psyching themselves up for battle. Instead, they were doing practical things. Sergeant Walsh distributed extra ammunition and showed the volunteers how to use human weapons. Private Stone, still bandaged, but insisting she was fit for duty, helped set up communication equipment. Lieutenant Rodriguez went over the tactical plan one more time, making sure everyone understood their role. They moved like professionals preparing for a job, not heroes preparing for death. But Zixtal could see the fear in their eyes. Every one of them was scared. They just weren't letting fear control their actions. The march to the forward position took 30 minutes. They could hear the bioconstructs long before they could see them. The sound was like nothing Zixtal had ever heard. Thousands of clawed feet striking the ground in unison, creating a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. Defensive position Murphy had chosen was a narrow pass between two rocky hills. It was the perfect bottleneck, forcing the enemy to attack in a concentrated formation where the defenders' weapons would be most effective. It was also the perfect trap, with no way to retreat once the enemy flanked their position. "Demolition charges set," Walsh reported as his team finished wiring the hills with explosives. "When they overrun us, we can bring down both hills and block the pass." When, not if, Zixtal noticed. The humans had already accepted that they were going to die here. The first bioconstructs appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. They moved in a living wave, thousands of creatures flowing across the landscape like a dark tide. Behind them came larger forms, biotanks the size of buildings, mobile weapons platforms that pulsed with organic energy, and flying creatures that darkened the sky with their numbers. "Contact in 2 minutes," Rodriguez reported from her position with the heavy weapons. Enemy strength estimated at over 10,000 ground units. Murphy keyed his radio to the coalition command frequency. "Admiral, this is Murphy. We are in position and ready to begin delaying action. Estimate we can hold for 90 minutes before position is overrun." "Understood, Captain," Admiral Dexmore replied. "The evacuation ships will be ready in 2 hours." "Then we'll hold for 2 hours," Murphy said simply. The bioconstructs hit their defensive line like a tsunami. Energy weapons lit up the pass as the defenders poured fire into the advancing enemy. Bioconstructs fell by the dozens, their bodies creating barriers that the next wave had to climb over. But for every creature they killed, 2 more took its place. Zixtal had never experienced combat like this. In previous battles, there had been tactics and maneuvering, advances and retreats. This was pure attrition. The humans had turned themselves into a wall of weapons and bodies, designed to absorb as much enemy force as possible before breaking. Private Stone's position was overrun first. Zixtal watched her fall back to a secondary position, then a third, then a fourth. Each time, she set off explosives that buried dozens of bioconstructs under tons of rock. Each time, she bought the defenders a few more minutes. Stone's position is lost, someone reported over the radio. Stone's fine, came her voice a moment later. Just moved to a new address. Still in business. That was when Zixtal truly understood what he was seeing. The humans weren't fighting to win. They knew they couldn't win. They were fighting to cost the enemy as much as possible. Every bioconstruct they killed was one less creature that would threaten the refugee camps. Every minute they held was 1 minute closer to civilian evacuation. They had turned war into mathematics. Their lives were variables in an equation where the only thing that mattered was buying time for others to escape. The battle had been raging for an hour and 30 minutes when Zixtal realized he might actually survive. Not because the situation had improved, but because he had learned to think like the humans around him. Survival wasn't the goal anymore. The goal was making sure the next transport ship had time to clear the atmosphere. Half. The defensive positions had been overrun. Bioconstructs had flanked them on both sides and were now attacking from 3 directions at once. Of the 57 defenders who had started the battle, only 12 were still able to fight. Zixtal was one of them, crouched behind a pile of bioconstruct corpses with a human rifle that was almost out of ammunition. Transport 7 has cleared atmosphere, came the report over the radio. 2 ships remaining. Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication system from her position on the left hill. Biotanks moving up the main approach. I can slow them down, but I need someone to spot for the artillery. I'll do it, Captain Murphy replied. Zixtal could see him moving across the battlefield, completely exposed to enemy fire, carrying a targeting designator toward the advancing biotanks. A flying bioconstruct dove at Murphy from above. Its razor-sharp claws raked across his back, tearing through his body armor and sending him sprawling. Blood spread across the ground beneath him, but he kept crawling toward his target position. Murphy's hit, Sergeant Walsh reported. I'm moving to assist. Negative, Murphy gasped into his radio. Hold your position. I can make it. Zixtal watched the human captain drag himself across 50 meters of open ground, while bioconstructs swarmed around him. Murphy's left leg was clearly broken, and he was leaving a trail of blood, but he never stopped moving. When he finally reached the targeting position, his designator lit up the biotanks with invisible laser energy that guided the coalition artillery strikes. Explosions lit up the valley as artillery shells found their targets. Biotanks that had been advancing steadily toward the refugee camps suddenly stopped, their organic hulls torn open by high explosive rounds, but the victory came at a terrible cost. The artillery had given away Murphy's position, and bioconstructs were converging on him from all directions. Murphy, get out of there, Rodriguez called over the radio. Murphy looked down at his mangled leg, then at the bioconstructs surrounding him. Zixtal could see the calculation in the human's eyes. He couldn't run. He could barely crawl. But he still had one more way to help. Tell Katie I was thinking of her, Murphy said calmly. He pulled a thermal grenade from his belt and smiled at Zixtal across the battlefield. Tell her daddy loved her very much. The explosion vaporized Murphy and every bioconstruct within 30 meters of his position. The blast cleared a gap in the enemy line that allowed the remaining defenders to fall back to their final positions. Transport 8 has cleared atmosphere, came the report. 1 ship remaining, 9 defenders left. Bioconstructs pouring into the valley from every direction. The final transport ship struggling to load the last group of civilians while its engines warmed up for departure. Sergeant Walsh keyed his radio to the Coalition command frequency. "Admiral, we can't hold much longer. How much more time do you need?" 15 minutes for final loading, then another 10 for atmospheric clearance. Admiral Vexmore replied. Walsh looked around at his remaining soldiers. Private Stone was still fighting, despite wounds that should have killed her hours ago. 2 Coalition volunteers were sharing ammunition with human Marines they had met that morning. Everyone was bleeding. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone knew they had reached the end. 25 minutes, Walsh said to his troops. "We need to give them 25 more minutes." "We can do 25 minutes," Stone replied, reloading her weapon with hands that shook from blood loss. "We've come this far." The final stand took place in a circle of broken rocks at the center of the valley. 9 defenders against thousands of bioconstructs that had learned to counter every weapon and tactic the Coalition possessed. It should have been over in seconds. Instead, it lasted exactly 25 minutes. Zixtal would never be able to explain how they held that long. The humans fought with a desperation that transcended military training. When their weapons ran out of ammunition, they used knives. When their knives broke, they used rocks. When there were no rocks left, they used their bare hands. He watched Private Stone tackle a bioconstruct twice her size and drive her combat knife into its brain while its claws tore through her chest armor. He watched Sergeant Walsh detonate his remaining explosives even though he was standing directly on top of them. He watched human soldiers make choices that no rational being would make, sacrificing themselves to buy a few more seconds for people they would never meet. "Final transport has cleared atmosphere," Admiral Vexmore announced. "All civilians are safe. Evacuation complete." Of the 9 defenders in the final circle, only Zixtal survived to hear those words. He was buried under a pile of bioconstruct corpses, bleeding from dozens of wounds, but somehow still alive when Coalition reinforcements arrived 3 hours later. The rescue team found him clutching Captain Murphy's personal photograph. The picture of 8-year-old Katie Murphy had somehow survived the battle undamaged, her bright smile untouched by the carnage around her. 6 months later, Zixtal stood on Earth in front of a small house with yellow flowers in the garden. Katie. Murphy answered the door with her father's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She was exactly as beautiful as her picture, but there was something different about her now. She had the same look Zixtal had seen in her father's eyes, the quiet strength of someone who had learned that some things were more important than being safe. "Are you the alien who fought with my daddy?" she asked. "Yes," Zixtal replied. "I am. Was he brave?" Zixtal knelt down so he could look directly into her eyes. He thought about everything he had witnessed on Kepler 442b, the space battle where humans had sacrificed themselves to save strangers, the ground fighting where they had turned fear into fuel for impossible courage, the final stand where they had bought time for others with their lives. "Your father and his people taught the galaxy what real courage looks like," he told her. "They showed us that true strength isn't the absence of fear. It's being terrified and standing up anyway. The day I fought beside humans, I learned that there are things worth being afraid for." Katie smiled and took the photograph from his hands. Daddy always said the scary stuff was the most important stuff. Behind her, Zixtal could see a wall covered with photographs. Dozens of human faces looked back at him. Captain Murphy, Lieutenant Rodriguez, Sergeant Walsh, Private Stone, and all the others who had died on Kepler 442b. Each picture was surrounded by flowers and small personal items left by families and friends. But these weren't memorials to the dead. They were reminders to the living. Each photograph carried the same message that Katie Murphy had learned from her father, that ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things when others needed protection. Zixtal returned to Coalition. Space with a new understanding of his human allies. They weren't fearless warriors or natural heroes. They were scared, fragile beings who had made a choice. When faced with darkness, they had decided to be the light that others could follow to safety. In his final report to Coalition Command, Zixtal wrote, "Humans do not fight because they are unafraid. They fight because they are afraid of what happens when good people do nothing. This makes them the most dangerous species in the galaxy to those who would harm the innocent, and the most valuable allies to those who stand for justice." The report was classified and filed away in Coalition archives. But its message spread through the military. When the worst happened, when all hope seemed lost, when someone needed to stand between darkness and light, call the humans. They would be afraid, but they would come anyway, and that made all the difference.